So I'd like to welcome you to the Festival of Ideas. Absolute pleasure to welcome you here this evening. It is my immense pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Sue Mendus. Sue is Morel. I'm going to say it wrong already. Morel. Professor Emerita, University of York, and former director of the Morel Centre for Toleration. She's published widely on topics in modern and historical political philosophy, with a special emphasis on toleration. In 2004, Sue was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, and from 2008 to 2012, she was Vice President Social Sciences of the Academy. She's a founding Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales, and in 2012 was awarded a CBE for services to political science. Sue is the kind of person who has a biography that covers several pages, which just shows you how many wonderful things she's done. I will get out of the way. Sue, it's over to you. There will be time for questions at the end, so do get thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Gary, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. This talk begins, in a sense, on the 23rd of June 2016, which was referendum day. And on that day, I was appointed a director of the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust. And I remained a director of that trust for over 9 years, nearly 10 years, until December, until this last Christmas, when I stood down. The trust's offices are out at Clifton, next to the YMCA and near the homestead. So I went out there for meetings and so on, and all the offices are there, and there is also there, or there was, a sort of study bedroom, a room that was the size of a student study bedroom. And that room was full, and I mean full, wall to wall, ceiling to floor, of box files. And in those box files were minutes and letters, correspondence, agendas, dinner invitations, and the note of who ate what at the dinner, going back to the 1960s. My blood ran cold because I'm not a historian, as you're about to discover. I'm not a historian, but I looked at this room and I thought, well, this room is one burst pipe away from the complete destruction of the history of this trust. You only need that, or an electrical short, and it's good night Vienna, really. So I made it my business to campaign vigorously for the removal of all that archived material from the Garden House at Clifton to the Borthwick, up at the University of York. And that's, I battled and battled, and that's eventually what happened. On the 17th of August, 2021, a man and a van, it was actually two men and a van, came to the Garden House and took away the 300 box files and brought them to the Borthwick, where Sally Ann, it was almost like a religious service. Sally Ann silently and reverentially took delivery of them. And the trust then asked that these be put in proper order up at the Borthwick, and that they join other Rowntree archives which are there. And so that's what happened. And then my husband, who is sitting here now, miraculously really, said, so you've moved it all from one room where nobody ever looks at it to another room where nobody will ever look at it. And he recovered quite rapidly, really. He was out of intensive care in no time at all. It was a tribute to the National Health Service that they managed to do that for him. But in all fairness, there is a point. You don't want to move things from a room in the Garden House where nobody ever sees it to another room in the Borthwick where it's I mean, not unloved, but it's unknown. So the point of this talk, or a point of this talk, is to do my little bit, and it is a little bit, but it's to do my little bit towards spreading the word that that archive is there at the Borthwick. It is freely available to anyone and everyone. Don't all go together, because there's not a big staff there. But it is freely available to anybody and anyone and everyone who wants to see it. And not to spare her blushes, Sally Ann has done a fantastic job of cataloguing and curating and ordering this archive and other Rowntree archives as well. So there is a huge amount there which bears lots and lots of inspection. And I hope that you will at least bear in mind that that is something that you can do. And what's coming now is the talk about what happened, in a sense, when I opened one of these boxes. I thought, well, I better do my bit, I better get a talk going, and I'll open a box and I'll see what happens. Well, it wasn't quite as simple as that, but this is the story of what happened when I opened the box. So what's coming now? As you can see, I've called it Six Penn'orth of Hope, Gambling and the Rowntree Trusts. And I'll explain at the very end why it's called Six Penn'orth of Hope. But I want to start by saying something about this trust, about the Rowntree Reform Trust. And so I start here. And there are no prizes for guessing that this is Joseph Rowntree. On the 29th of December, 1904, he wrote a memorandum. And in that memorandum, he said, this is from his home in St. Mary's. And in that memorandum, he said, I've lost a page. In that memorandum, he said, "It is frequently and truly said that money is generally best spent by persons during their lifetime. I have in the past, according to my power, endeavoured to act in remembrance of this. Considerably larger means have, however, come to me later in life, and the practical question was presented to me, how can this property be applied in the future so as to secure equal results to those which might have been obtained had I had the administration of it over a longer period." So basically, he's got more money than he knows what to do with. This is the truth of it. He's 68. In 1904, he's 68. He's got much more money than he knows what to do with. And the question now is, well, what had I better do then? I can't spend all this money in a proper way. What shall I do? And I don't know to what extent it's Rowntree, to what extent it's Quaker, to what extent it's nonconformist. But I certainly brought up, I know I don't sound it, but I was brought up in the Welsh Baptist Chapel. It was really, really wicked and sinful to keep money when you didn't, to leave, as it were, money behind. You must not stock it up. And that's what he's saying. He's got more money than he knows what to do with. And what he must do now is find a use for this money, a proper use for this money. And the use that he finds is to establish 3 trusts. This is all 1904. The Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, which exists to this day with this name. The Joseph Rowntree Village Trust, which has morphed in various ways and now comes out the other end as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And the Joseph Rowntree Social Service Trust Limited, and limited is important for a reason I'll give you in a moment. The Joseph Rowntree Social Service Trust Limited, which became and is now the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, my trust. That's the trust I was on for 9 years. And in establishing these 3 trusts to spend his money that he has too much of, he makes a suggestion. And people, if you're Joseph Rowntree, people tend to accept your suggestions in a way they don't accept mine. But he has those 3 trusts, and he has an umbrella project, as it were, aim, ambition, for the 3 of them together. And that umbrella ambition is to investigate the underlying causes of wickedness and of evil in the society of the time, in British society in 1904. And he writes, famously, he writes, "The soup kitchen in York never has difficulty in obtaining adequate financial aid, but an inquiry into the extent and causes of poverty would enlist little support." So his thought is, don't prioritise assistance to the poor, ask yourself why they are poor. So it's not to say the alleviation of poverty is unimportant. It is important, but it's more important to know, not to give people soup at the soup kitchen, but to ask, why do they need a soup kitchen? What is it in British society that's today, in 1904, that presses them, pushes them in the direction of a soup kitchen? That then is the overarching aim for all three trusts, is to look into the underlying causes of evil and wickedness. But the Social Service Trust Limited, now the Reform Trust, has a specific additional aim. And that's to address political problems. I'm emphasising the fact that it's the Social Service Trust Limited because it is not a charity. It is political money. The directors of the trust have money which they can spend any way they want. You don't have to spend it on charitable causes. You can spend it on anything you like. And that, as a director, was a massive trust. To have someone say, here's the money and I'm not going to tell you how you can use it. You can do anything you want with it. And what he asks the trust to do is this. He says, and this is the special instruction to what is now the Reform Trust and was the Social Service Trust. Perhaps the greatest danger of our national life arises from the power of selfish and unscrupulous wealth, which influences public opinion largely through the press. If the funds permitted and the directors of the Social Service Trust were equal to the task, it would be quite in accordance with my wish that they should control, by purchase or otherwise, a newspaper or newspapers, conducting them not with a primary view to profit, but with the object of influencing public thought in right channels. They're to turn people's minds in the right direction. What is the right direction? Well, he gives a view on that too. He wants the newspapers, the trust via the newspapers, to sound a clear note with regard to the great scourges of humanity, especially with regard to war, slavery, intemperance, impurity, the opium traffic, and gambling. The influence of the newspaper should also be on the side of religious liberty, free trade, and economical government. So that's a special role for the Social Service Trust, now the Reform Trust, is to get some sort of control of newspapers and to use those newspapers to influence people in the right moral way, that is, against drink, against slavery, particularly against war. And you can't use charitable money to buy a newspaper and tell people, give these political messages. So that's why it's a limited company. The trust pays its taxes, and it's not a charitable trust and never has been. Why is he saying that in 1904? And I'm sure there are lots of reasons, but a reason that comes through in looking at the documents is the very long shadow that is cast in 1904 by the Boer War. The Boer War unsettled the British Empire. It gave people serious anxiety about empire and about the continuation of empire. And some of you may know Kipling's poem, The Lesson, let us admit it freely as business people should. We have had no end of a lesson, it will do us no end of good. The British were trounced in various ways and humiliated in the Boer War, and that casts a very long shadow. And you see that here, that's an 1899 drawing of what was called Black Week, the defence of Colenso. Those defeats in the Boer War were a massive blow for Britain, primarily because they undermined the confidence in the stability of empire and the invincibility of the British Army. There were other reasons, but that's a major reason, and it's a reason that influences Joseph Rowntree. also, and this is truly astonishing, I think, also at this time, the Boer War is the first war to be fought at a time of mass literacy in Britain. The 1870 Education Act, the Foster Education Act, delivered a British public that was largely literate, very largely literate, more so than ever before. So here they are, they can read. The working classes can now read, many of them, and they want to read all about it. And so the Boer War is reported back in Britain, and people can read all about it. It's a massive, massive industry coming out of London. Alan Lee, who writes extensively on this, coming out of London in 1900 were 472 daily newspapers. That's not counting Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. It's not counting Doncaster or the Manchester Guardian. It's just coming out of London of 472 daily newspapers. Many of them, it must be said, were local papers, but a large number were not. And you needed staff to provide the copy for these newspapers. And so there were at any one time during the Boer War around 60 correspondents in South Africa, 20 belonging to the Times. And they weren't nobody, these journalists. If you look there, I don't know if I can use this pointer. Is it working? No, it doesn't matter. If you look there, the man standing on the right is Rider Haggard of King Solomon's Mines. And the man front right is Rudyard Kipling. They were both correspondents for the newspapers during the Boer War. Also out there were Erskine Childers, Conan Doyle, Baden-Powell, and Winston Churchill. So these weren't hacks. These weren't journalistic hacks out there. These were serious writers, powerful writers, who were out there sending back, and Kipling, of course, sending back significant copy. But what must now be said is that in 1901, there were 472 papers coming out of London daily, and not one of them was anti-war. They were all in favour. The Manchester Guardian and others, which I come to, we can bracket, but coming out of London, there's no anti-war paper. They were all what was known as warmongering papers. And at that point, 1903, all of this is going on, or has just gone on. It's the shadow being cast by this. That's going on. People have died in industrial quantities. Newspapers, everyone is reading the newspaper. They're hungry for the newspapers. But what the newspaper is telling them is that the war is a good thing and they should support it. In 1903, therefore, Lloyd George approached George Cadbury of Cadbury's Dairy Milk and encouraged him to purchase the Daily News and to convert it, I'm quoting, to convert it overnight to an anti-war newspaper. And Cadbury agreed to that, reluctantly, but he agreed, and noted that the Daily News, this is Cadbury, the Daily News ought to be a power for peace in the south of England, as the Manchester Guardian is in the north. So he's encouraged, and Lloyd George always had mixed motives, and this was no exception. But nonetheless, he did want the paper purchased in order to promote anti-war. And Cadbury did that. And 5 minutes later, this man, Charles Starmer, approached Joseph Rowntree to buy the newspaper, a newspaper called the Northern Echo. This, I get the piece of paper. The Northern Echo is an astonishing paper. It was the first halfpenny paper to come. It came out of Darlington. And there's this terrific book about it, Attacking the Devil, 130 Years of the Northern Echo. It's a liberal paper. It's a paper for the working man. The working man is an important person in this talk. It's a paper for the working man because the working man can afford a halfpenny. And so the working man will buy the Northern Echo, and the Northern Echo will tell the working man to be suspicious about the war and about other wars. It will have the right liberal views. So in 1903, Cadbury is encouraged by Lloyd George to purchase a paper, and Joseph Rowntree is encouraged to purchase a paper. And he purchases the Northern Echo coming out of Darlington. And then it doesn't stop, because look now, between 1903 and 1911, there is the purchase of the Northern Echo, the Bishop Auckland Chronicle, the Cleveland Mercury, what you can read as well as I can. They're all there. 1909, the joint purchase by Cadbury and Rowntree of the Star and the Morning Leader. And those papers were purchased with the explicit purpose of keeping them out of Conservative hands. They were about to fall into Conservative hands, and Cadbury and Rowntree are persuaded to buy them. And then 1911, the Sheffield Daily and Weekly Independent. So there it is. The talk now should sort of end here. The trust is set up in 1904. The instruction to the trust is to buy newspapers and spread the word of liberalism, peace, and no alcohol, and all of this. 1911, all these papers are, if not owned by, at least there is a very, very significant interest. The Rowntrees, the Social Service Trust, has a very significant interest in these papers, even if it doesn't control them. So everything in the garden appears to be lovely. If you're a director of this trust now, in 1910, 1911, you've been told to do something and you've done it, and that's grand. Well, it's not. It's not grand, because into this Garden of Eden now come two serpents, as it were. The first is this man. He is Edward Fry. Remember Fry's Turkish Delight, full of Eastern promise? Yeah. When I walked home from school in the 1950s, I had to go under a railway bridge in Swansea, and above the railway bridge was a metal advertisement of the Fry's 5 boys. And there's a special prize for anybody who remembers the Fry. They were desperation, pacification, expectation, realization, and acclamation. So there's desperation when he thinks when he's got no chocolate, pacification because he's going to get the chocolate, realization when he has the chocolate. Now I've missed desperation, pacification, expectation, realization, and acclamation, and rejoicing when he gets the chocolate. And there they were, Fry's 5 boys. It's a very clear memory of that. Yeah, I remember it for, well, I like chocolate, you know. I married a man who worked for Rowntree. How can so there you go. This man, Edward Fry, as you can see, he's a barrister. He's a member of the Fry family of that dynasty, and he's a very prominent Quaker. And in 1911, in August of 1911, he wrote an open letter to the Society of Friends entitled Betting Newspapers and Quakerism. And the letter accuses both the Rowntree family and the Social Service Trust of profiting from the evil that is gambling through their ownership of newspapers which publish prophecies, that is to say, betting tips, predict the future. They prophesy who will be the winner of the 345 at Doncaster. And he says in this open letter, he writes, "The object of this paper is to urge upon the attention of the Society of Friends the action of some of its members in promoting by means of newspapers the evil practice of betting. In this matter, 4 papers are concerned: the Northern Echo, the Sheffield Independent, the Morning Leader, and the Star. The Northern Echo is a daily newspaper. Remember, this is owned largely by the Trust. Is a daily newspaper published in Darlington. I've lost a page again. Bear with me. There it is. Published in Darlington. And this paper publishes not merely the record of past events in horse races, or of the odds, but anticipations of the future. In other words, betting tips. It circulates chiefly among the working classes of Darlington and Newcastle upon Tyne, and is known popularly as Rowntree's paper. And then there's some facts. These facts afford clear evidence that the paper is one which owes its success to the betting news. So what's being said, Loca has brought up a Welsh Baptist, these Rowntrees, the family, the trust, are the whited sepulchres. They appear to be clean on the outside. Inside they are rotten. They are making their money from prophesying, from betting tips, and they are impoverishing the working man. The poor are poor, and they are driving themselves further into poverty by gambling. And who is encouraging them to gamble? The Rowntrees, that's who. So Fry is pretty robust, but Fry is nothing by comparison with this man, Strachey. Strachey is the editor of the Spectator, and he really lays in to the trust and to the family in editorial after editorial in the Spectator, complaining. It's a vendetta. It's not just a pamphlet, it's a vendetta, which goes on and on and on. And he says, the most widely read, most efficient, and most popular of betting papers in the metropolis is owned and controlled by the members of the Quaker philanthropic family of Cadbury and the Joseph Rowntree Social Service Trust, an organisation which was founded to improve the moral and material condition of the poor and to render that social service which, apart from business and economic conditions, is due from man to his fellow man. And here it comes. For the Joseph Rowntree Social Service Trust, my trust, social service takes the form of supplying working men with the facilities for ruining themselves and their families by putting money upon horses. Last summer, a Liberal MP, Mr. Markham, had to prosecute a postman for the theft of a cheque for £150. The man, his wife declared, had been in the habit of following the betting tips provided by the Star, with the usual result. This is the kind of social service provided by the Social Service Trust through the medium of its newspaper. And finally, this is a situation, or shall we say, a moral cesspool of hypocrisy, cant, stupidity, self-righteousness, and muddle-headedness, which ought to be cleaned out and got rid of. So if you want to say, well, we'll put you down as maybe then, shall we? Not sure. This is a massive litany of charges against the family and against the trust. And so this is all in the public domain, so I know all of this from the public domain. But I was at this time a member, I mean, not in 1904, but as I'm reading it, I was a member of that trust. And because I spent really almost all my working life sitting on committees, I then thought, well, what are they doing in the committee now? When the trust meets, when the directors meet, what is it that they're saying to each other about these sorts of allegations? And it is really vitriolic, as you can hear. It's hugely vitriolic. It goes on and on and on. What are they doing about it? Because if it had happened, as it were, on my watch, I wouldn't just have been sitting there saying, well, we're all entitled to our opinion. I would have been saying something, doing something. So at that point, I come back to the archive. At that point, I go to the Borthwick and I look up the minutes of the meetings of the Joseph Rowntree Social Service Trust for that period. And I have to say now that this makes really, really terrible reading. I mean, just depressing reading. Let's look again. 1903, Joseph Rowntree purchases the Northern Echo, at the request of the editor, Charles Starmer. Then all the other papers that I put up there, they're also purchased, and they all, or nearly all, contain these betting tips. In 1906, Joseph Rowntree says to the Trust, to the Social Service Trust at its board meeting, that he is very unhappy about the fact that these papers contain betting tips. He considered that they were open to grave objection, he says. And the directors agree with him. Yes, it's grave objection. We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be encouraging the working man to dig himself deeper and deeper into poverty. And so for the next 4 years, 1906 to 1910, they don't publish the betting tips. There's no more prophecy at that time. And if you now look at the minute books of the Trust for the years 1906 to 1910, it is just catastrophic. It is a serious financial and indeed moral catastrophe. And I just give you a few bits. In November of 1906, Joseph Rowntree says we mustn't have these betting tips anymore. It's no good. February of 1907, this is all from the minute book, he makes a voluntary contribution of £32,000 to the newspaper, to help the newspaper. I don't really believe in financial converters, but the Bank of England converter tells you that £32,000 in 1907 is about 3.5 million now. At the same time, February 1907, the Social Service Trust, my trust, loans £13,500 to the newspaper. And that's about £1.5 million. A week later, on the 4th of March, it's noted that Joseph Rowntree has contributed £64,800, roughly 7 million, in gifts to the newspapers. And then there's this rather sad bit, with the hope that some money might be left over for the study of temperance. Well, it wasn't, so that's that. 12th of March 1907, another £7,000 is loaned by the Social Service Trust. And the whole thing ends here. These 4 years are summed up now, roughly, by these figures. Over the 4-year period, the Northern Echo and the Consortium lost £29,395, whilst receiving voluntary gifts of £64,800, gifts from Joseph Rowntree personally, and loans from the Social Service Trust of £45,000. There is no evidence, as far as I can see, but others may correct me, that these loans were ever repaid. There is no record that I can see of that. It was money down the plug hole, as far as the trust was concerned. And so it's catastrophic. And it comes to a head, the whole thing comes to a head, in a general meeting in 1910, when J.B. Morrell made a lengthy statement as to the desirability of reviewing the publication of sporting predictions in the Northern Echo. And J.B. Morrell says this: the Northern Echo must cater for a large class who insist on taking a newspaper which gives them the sporting information they want. Members of the Trust do not feel justified in asking the newspaper to refrain from carrying out the policy they think best in the interests of the paper, but they have arrived at this decision with deep reluctance. So there's a 4-year experiment with no betting tips. The financial situation is as shown at the end of those 4 years, and they then feel there just isn't any choice now but to start publishing the betting tips again. And there isn't any choice, partly for financial reasons, but partly for ideological reasons, because the situation is this: why are they making this loss? Because nobody's buying the paper, that's why. But if nobody's buying the paper, if the working man won't buy the paper, then the working man isn't getting the moral message that he shouldn't be, that he should be anti-war. So it's failing both financially and in its own terms. And that's when the decision is taken to reintroduce the betting tips, because that's the only way of reaching the working man. And that's the only way of putting his mind, his opinions, in right direction. And so it seems to me, I want to say two things now. So firstly, I think allegations that this, in the Spectator and elsewhere, that the Trust or the Rowntrees were profiting or even profiteering from this are just totally false. It's hemorrhaging money. They are not making money from this. No one is making money from this. On the contrary, these newspapers are hemorrhaging money because nobody will buy them, and nobody will buy them because they haven't got the betting tips. And that's why the decision is taken to go back. So the charge of profiteering, I think, is just false. The charge of hypocrisy is more difficult. It's a lot more difficult. What I want to do now is just briefly look at this pamphlet, which was written as a reply to Edward Fry. In 1911, I keep saying they because they identify themselves only as those against whom Fry wrote. And I take it that's the Cadburys and the Rowntrees. Well, it is. The first part of this pamphlet is just a lot of correction of factual error. But then there are two justifications for continuing with the betting tips, with the prophecies. The first is the fear of war. The Trust itself was set up in 1904 in the long shadow cast by the Boer War. In 1911, looking again at the minutes and at this document, at the minutes of the Trust meetings, 1911, that fear of war is getting more and more and more intense. And the pamphlet says, the indictment against us rests upon the fact that we have acquired and continue to hold considerable interest in 4 newspapers containing betting and racing information. We were led to accept this responsibility because we viewed with great anxiety the fact that the daily press of the country was passing more and more into the hands of those whose avowed policy and whose ultimate aims we believe to be a peril to the state. And here it comes now. The danger we feared most in buying these papers, continuing with the tips, was that by the unchecked action of an irresponsible press, the country might be driven into war. For some months, a daily paper with a very large circulation, it's the Daily Mail, some things don't change, persistently embittered the relations of this country with Germany, irritating it by a succession of pinpricks and false statements, at the same time suppressing evidence of the goodwill of the German people towards the English. Let no one think that there is nothing to fear. If present tendencies continue unchecked, the disaster to European civilization of a war between England and Germany will certainly come. That's written in 1911, and you don't need me to tell you what happened 3 years later. And they are seeing this coming down the line, that they are seriously traumatized by the Boer War and the experience there. And what they're seeing coming down the line is a war with Germany. And why is that war coming down the line? Because newspapers like the Daily Mail are embittering the relationship between people in this country and people in Germany. That is, I find that really quite moving. That if you look at it in the documents, in the Trust documents, they are really scared. And you and I know that they were right to be scared, because this was indeed coming down the line. And that's why they decide that they will carry on, will continue the betting tips, is in an attempt to boost the readership, in an attempt to turn the opinion in right direction. The second argument with which they defend themselves in the reply I think it's just very, very touching. And it's a longer argument to make out, but I will be brief, because I'm hoping that when I've finished this, have another go. The second argument is about the evil of gambling. And what's held against the Rowntrees generally, but Seabohm in particular, is that he was a very, very prominent member of the National Anti-Gambling League, and he edited in 1905, he edited this book, Betting and Gambling, A National Evil, which contains articles by himself and also by Ramsay MacDonald and Hobson, the political theorist, and so on, explaining the dangers of gambling and betting. And what's being said about Seabohm Rowntree is that he is indeed the Whited Sepulchre, that he is prominent in the National Anti-Gambling League. Where does he get his money from? Well, he gets it from gambling. That's where he gets it from these newspapers. So it's in that sense an easy target. But this is the reply that comes from the friends, as it were, in this pamphlet. May we point out that no campaign against a widespread evil, such as gambling, can be successful unless that evil is dealt with in its relation to the wider social problem. Men have begun to understand the appalling conditions under which not only the submerged tense, but vast numbers above them live. They know how great are the numbers who cannot obtain the necessary food for physical efficiency, with whom life is so hard that the spiritual nature is stunted. They know the housing conditions under which families are herded together so that decency becomes well nigh impossible, and the vast numbers that are born apparently foredoomed to a worthless, if not a degraded life. And this is Hungate around the turn of the century, where some of these people were people living in abject and absolute poverty in conditions close to destitution. And what's said here so there are two things. Much of the late 19th century, early 20th century account of gambling will tell you that this is due to moral weakness. The poor are shiftless, feckless, hopeless, helpless, useless. They lack willpower, they lack proper character, and that's where it all goes wrong. What is said in this reply and throughout Seabohm Rowntree and everywhere else and in the memorandum, it is the structure of society which gives us this. So if you look at the causes of the evil, it isn't that people are feckless, hopeless and helpless, though probably they are. It's because the structure of the society is wrong. That's what's driving people in this direction. And that's why Joseph Rowntree insists on an investigation of the causes of poverty, the causes of evil, and the causes of weakness. And then this is then my title. In the 1930 study of poverty, Seabohm Rowntree talks of a man, who is an inveterate gambler. He cannot stop. He's very, very poor, and he just gambles and gambles. And they say to him, well, why do you've got virtually nothing. Why do you gamble away the little that you have? And he says, because I would rather have 6 penn'orth of hope than 6 penn'orth of electricity. And that's what's going on here, that the little gamble gives hope to the hopeless. They can't save anything from the money they have. They can't plan for the future. They can't have any decent existence unless there's a little flutter that comes in, and then decency may be possible just for a while. And this is exactly the argument, or the line of argument, put forward by George Orwell in The Road to Wigan Pier, when Orwell says, above all, there is gambling, the cheapest of all luxuries. Even people on the verge of starvation can buy a few days' hope, something to live for, by having a penny on a sweepstake. And what I do find really quite moving here is that whatever's said about the profiteering, the gambling, the hypocrisy, all of that, there is in this a deep understanding, I think, and a deep sympathy for and compassion for the plight of the poor, and an attempt genuinely to understand what it's like to be them. So I'm going to finish in about 2 minutes. All of that is just to say that's what I found. I thought I'd better open this box and have a look and see what's in. And that's what I found. I hope you found it interesting. There are 299 other boxes. So there's, and I'm nearly 75. So there's not a lot of time for me, but there are loads and loads of boxes, and they all contain, well, not the ones about typewriter ribbons and so on, but mainly they contain some very interesting stuff. And I think things which help us to have a clearer understanding, not of the solution to the problems, but of the nature of those problems and the way they presented themselves to people who were on the inside. So thank you very much.
There are plenty of things I'm sure you want to ask about. So we do have time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. We'll try and get through as many as possible. We do have our help here who's got a microphone. Please do speak into the microphone so everybody can hear, because this is being filmed and we'll go live on YouTube. So in the future there are other people who have got damn, I wish I missed that. YouTube. However, I'm going to do the old, while you have a think, I'm going to go for the old chair's privilege and take the first one.
Okay.
I think something I heard the kind of gasp around the room was the scale of the losses of loads to the Northern Echo. And as you said, there's many different ways of measuring the worth of these things. The one I used, I was quickly adding it up in the corner. I had it as somewhere near 70 million, depending on what measure you use with inflation and everything. Yeah. What happened to the Northern Echo? Because there's still a paper column.
Yes, it's still going. It's still going. Yeah, to be perfectly honest with you, Gary, I've not got. I read the bit about 1904, 1905, 1911, but I haven't got to the end, so I don't altogether know. But yeah, the Northern Echo still goes. I think what happened, as far as I know, what happened as far as the trust was concerned, that the trust in the end just gave up on newspapers because, well, for the reasons some of the reasons I've alluded to. So it has nothing to do with those papers anymore, and indeed hasn't had for some time.
And is it like owning? They always say like owning a football club is a good way to turn a large fortune into a small fortune.
Yeah. I think in this case, yes, it clearly was. It clearly was, and it was just. I think that the real tragedy is that not only that they lost money, but that if they tried to do the right thing, to give the right opinions, that in itself guaranteed that they would lose money.
Interesting.
Lose more money.
Even more. Any questions? Yes, I think gentleman in the back. You were first thing. We'll come to as many as you can. Sorry, I have to be David Dimbleby a bit.
Sue, it's a really interesting talk, and I was struck by quite a something nagging away me, a contemporary echo of the tale you told. It's a sort of live debate out there. It's the BBC Radio 4 betting tips, and I think it was only 2 years ago they stopped doing them. And because they were daily, you know, for anybody listening to Radio 4 first thing in the morning, somewhere in the news and the weather, they gave gambling tips, and they made a joke out of it because they were almost invariably wrong, you know. So if you're going to, you know, you're never going to get rich from Radio 4, but that stopped 2 years ago. And so somewhere in the BBC there are similar, you know, there are going to be committee minutes. They sat around a table, a group of people, thought, right, and perhaps they had incoming critique again. This is against the ideology of the corporation, you know, it is gambling, this is bad. But they've been doing it since forever, and then they stopped doing it. And then I think they brought it back recently, but only for the big races. So they now do tips on Derby, Grand National, St. Ledger, but not every day. So it just seems like a mirroring of this. And again, a group of people in a room, minutes, decision, the board, what are we going to do about this? And they reached a compromise. They kind of brought it back.
Yeah. Well, I would have... It's really strange because I have, like most people, I guess, or many people, I have the radio on, Radio 4 in the morning. And until this very minute, I had not realised that they dropped those. I mean, I don't.
Quite recently.
Yeah, I don't follow the horses, but I recall. Yeah, that's right, exactly. But you're right, they don't do it now.
And some sort of moral decision has been made by the BBC to stop doing it.
Right.
Okay. Other questions?
Sorry, that wasn't a question, sir.
No, that's fine. That's okay. That's okay.
Yes, go to the lady on the end, please.
Thank you. That was brilliant, Sue. Thank you. Fry brought attention for the Society of Friends to the issues. Did you find anything about the response in other newspapers, so those that were not controlled by the Quaker families? How did they respond to this story? Did they run it and make the most out of it to the detriment of the other newspapers?
Right.
Or
That's an interesting question. The short answer is I don't know. I really just don't know. I don't get a sense that this is widely known, this controversy, as it were, is widely known about at all. But it was big in the Spectator, which is not nothing. But to be honest, Kathy, perhaps I'd go have a look, but I really don't know what other papers did.
I just think we talk these days about something being given the Daily Mail headline.
Yes, yeah.
You can imagine what
the
Daily Mail would have loved.
What is clear is that the Daily Mail, even then, was the Daily Mail. I mean, so some things don't change. I'm pretty confident it's the Daily Mail that's referred to at the end, but in the reply, as really embittering and twisting relationships between this country and German people, and telling lies in order to whip up that I'm pretty confident was the Daily Mail. And it was really to prevent that sort of thing, or to provide a counterbalance to it, that both Rowntree and Cadbury purchased the papers. It was, in that sense, a moral obligation which they felt.
Okay, Sarah.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, that was really interesting. I wonder, when you were looking at the committee minutes, when they were discussing, what they were going to do about this, did you find Arnold Rowntree playing a particular part? Because he was Joseph's nephew rather than son.
Yes.
And in 1909, Joseph handed over to him the sort of commercial running of the newspapers. Now, that may have been because Arnold was good commercially, or it may have been just a slightly distance. And Arnold and Seabohm, although they were close, they argued over this for a great deal. And then Arnold became the MP for York for the next, till 1919. So actually, during that time, when he was MP, I mean, it must have been, in some ways, it must have been quite difficult to be running, looking after the newspapers and considering the money going down the plug hole at the same time. But did you come across any input from him into those discussions?
I wouldn't want to be quoted on this, but my impression is that officially he and J.B. Morrell were, as it were, in charge of the newspapers. That was their brief. It's not clear how much he did. It is clear that J.B. Morrell was very, very active. So if asked to bet, and I'm not a betting woman, I would bet that he wasn't doing a great deal at all. And most of the running is made, as far as you can tell from the minutes, which isn't always, they aren't always an accurate reflection. But insofar as I can see, he wasn't really very prominent at all. He wasn't busy and active in that sense. I think the hard lifting was done by J.B. Morrell. But that is a hunch, or I would want to go back and look further before committing on that. But that's my first thought.
We've probably time for one question. We may be able to squeeze in another one if we're quick. We'll go over here and then Stephen.
Thank you, Sue. That was fantastic. I was just wondering, did the committee look into the, as it were, the efficiency and effectiveness of the tips they were giving?
Well, Actually, that's an interesting question. Because, so this is what they used to do on Radio 4, wasn't it? At the end of the year, they would say, it's coming back to me now. Exactly. Gary, whatever his name was, at the end of the year would say, well, if you'd bet, £5 a day or something on this, you'd be £100 the loser. Now, I don't think there's... In this whole area of betting in the late 19th, early 20th century, the fact is there is an awful lot of urban myth and there's very little statistical evidence. So the word on the street is that people are running themselves into massive debt over and over. There is no serious evidence that this is going on. And I think, so to answer your question straightforwardly, I don't think there was very much by way of analysis, shall we say, of what went on.
Here we go. Last question, Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Sue. That was really wonderful. There's 2 points that I just wanted to refer to. I just wonder, to what extent was it the betting that caused the papers to be losing circulation? Do we know, for instance, whether after 1910 they did revive when the betting was brought back?
Yeah.
And the second thing about the hypocrisy question, what really strikes me is that this is exactly the same time that the great cocoa scandal was happening, 1904 to 1911, about the purchasing of cocoa from Sao Tome, which was delivered by slave labour. And it was exactly those right-wing papers that were taking on the progressive newspapers that Cadbury and Rowntree owned, with the very same criticism, hypocrisy. That here you are talking about slavery, and of course Joseph Rowntree mentions in his memorandum, the evil of slavery.
Yes.
And yet this issue of where you get your cocoa from. So I just wonder, and then the other final thing about that is that, of course, it was about 1911, 1912 that the creation of the company Rowntree Cadbury Fry, which was based here in York, was created to try and find alternative ways so from not using that cocoa that came from Sao Tome. So this was a fascinating period with all of this going on. But I just wondered if first about whether the gambling brought back the fortunes, or did they go, were there problems anyway? Secondly, do you think there's any connection between the critique of the right-wing press on lots of things that the Rowntrees and Cadburys were trying to achieve?
The latter, I just don't know. I really don't know enough about that cocoa problem, as it were, to say. So I just don't know about that. On the matter of the fortunes of the newspaper thereafter, things certainly did revive a bit for a little while. But I think what's conspicuous was the point at which they, when they stopped the betting tips, 1906, there was just this crash. Now, the recovery is then, there is some recovery. I wouldn't like to say how much or how long-lasting. There is some recovery, but it's the crash at the point at which they pull out the betting tips that really is alarming. Can I say one last thing? Yes. I was a sort of a bookies runner, which is perhaps why I have this interest. I went to school, it's not really that, I went to school in South Wales in the 1950s. And once a week, my grandmother, you'd go home for dinner in those days, didn't you? And my grandmother would give me once a week a sixpence, and wrapped around that sixpence was a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper was her bet. And she would say, when you go back to school, look for Mrs. Day on the corner of Baptistwell Street and give her this. But if you see a policeman, walk on to school. And the other thing she used to do, which I'd totally forgotten, she would sign her name. It would be at threepence each way on darkest night or whatever it was. She would not sign her name. Everybody in those days, in the 1950s, signed a pseudonym, so that if Mrs. Day was busted for taking bets off course, nobody would know that it was my grandmother who put the bet. So I guess I was born to be interested in this.
Sue, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
There's plenty of time. The sands of time are against us now. I'm afraid the race is run. Perhaps say there's the apocryphal story that someone did ask them how running the newspapers was going, and the answer was good to first.
Oh.
Thank you very much. And to have a sign of appreciation to Sally as well for doing the cataloguing for the archive as well.
Yes, it's a great job. It's a great job.